Welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. I'm Vered Kogan, and I'm very excited to introduce Kelly Lewis to you. Kelly is the co-founder of And Ryan, a leadership development consultancy committed to providing the space and tools for transformation. She's been using polarities as a lens in her coaching and client work for several decades, and is particularly curious about the roles that identity and vulnerability play in helping people effectively navigate paradoxical tensions, which we're going to learn more about today. Her book, Navigating Polarities, Using Both and Thinking to Lead Transformation, has become a go-to resource for people both new and well-versed in using polarities to deal with complexity and to lead transformation. In addition to teaching about polarities, Kelly is an executive coach and a leadership consultant whose work is based upon the principle that leadership is a way of being, not just something that people do. Welcome, Kelly.
Thanks, Vered. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Oh my goodness. I'm so excited to have this conversation. I think it's such an important conversation to have that any leader, and for that matter, any human, needs to be aware of, because it's something that will help them live an even richer life. And so would you be willing to share with us a little bit about how you got into this cool work that you do?
Yeah, I kind of somewhat fell into it. So the quick backstory is I spent the first half of my career in corporate America in a very large financial organization where what we used to call it back then was where I led operational infrastructure. So where kind of people, process, and technology came together to deliver some type of outcome. And in the midst of that career, which found me with a lot of responsibility at a pretty early age, I was really good at creating processes, solving problems, controlling outcomes. And one day, somebody that was working with me and for me on my team sat me down and said, "We know you love to solve problems, and we know you have really great solutions to those problems, but like what the team needs is for you to inspire answers. We don't need you to provide answers. We need you to inspire answers." And it was super humbling. It was one of the first times in my career that I was like, maybe my life, that I knew I didn't know. I didn't know how to do something, and it was somewhat terrifying. So I kind of sat with that for a little while, and then I decided, well, maybe I should go learn what really he was bringing forward was this distinction between managing and leading in my mind back then. It was like, and so I thought, well, what if I start to go learn how to lead? And at the time I had an executive coach, and I was really curious about coaching as a modality to help my leadership. I had no interest in becoming a coach, but I thought the way that coaching, everything from the type of listening and the type of questions and the type of direct communication, like all of these things, I thought, So I explored that, and I ended up at Georgetown University going through an executive coaching program. And about 3 months into that program, I realized, wow, like what I really love to do is to help people and teams of people grow within systems, within kind of operational, in this case, looking at leadership as a system. Maybe this is what I'll kind of go do. So 3 years later, I wrapped up that program, and I went and decided I was skeptical about the business results that would come from all the kind of coaching work I'd done. I could see the personal transformation, but I couldn't really see the business results. So I had a great team, and I had a lot of latitude, and there was about 300 people in my organization. And we explored really what it was like to bring a people methodology, a people focusing as much on people as we did process into the system. And at the time we were using lean and agile methodology to deliver stuff, that was kind of new back then. And it was the best 3 years of my career. And the results got better, the innovation got better, the whole, all the things got better. And then I left about 3 years after that and kind of went off and did my own thing, and have been doing that since. And in the midst of that experience, as well as supporting clients after that, what I discovered was the way I kind of saw the world, the way I made sense of the world, continued to hit up against barriers where I needed to expand how I saw the world. I needed to expand what I could see and how I made sense of things in order to continue to grow and to grow the people around me. There are lots of amazing theoretical frameworks out there that can support that, but I couldn't find one that was practical enough, that would support the theory that I could use with the client to really support them. And then I discovered polarities, and polarities kind of changed the game for me. Both it supported me in my own personal evolution and my own leadership development, but it became a practical. It's practical. It's also approachable framework that has deep theoretical kind of wisdom and underpinnings. And at the same time, it's super practical that I can use at any level of the system, individually, with a team, with an organization. You could look at it societally if you wanted to. It kind of scales to any level. And so I just started, getting really curious about it. And since then, I've been both a student and a teacher of that work, since I started working with it 15 plus years ago.
So cool. Thank you for sharing that. Right. So it's like, for people out there that are, getting some feedback perhaps, or having an event, right, that kind of gets them to this place of not knowing, not being grounded in something that is real or true or certain, to stay curious and to explore and to learn, and that will come. The clarity will come. And then, of course, you get to apply it and help others as well. So thank you for sharing that. That's so cool.
Yeah, you're welcome. And, it's funny to think about it through a polarity lens, because knowing and not knowing is a polarity, right? And up until that point, I had really relied on and had gotten, my career was based on knowing. Up until that point, I was paid to know. And then all of a sudden I ran into this place of like, whoa, I don't know. And what's my relationship with not knowing? And can I make enough space to expand so that I can both know and not know, as opposed to, what an either or mind would tell us, which is, if I'm going to go into this place of not knowing, I might have to give up or lose all of this knowing that's kind of gotten me to where I am. And one of the things that's beautiful about a polarity lens is it's not about giving up or compromising or losing. It's about expanding. And like we talked about a minute ago, the expansion can sometimes be uncomfortable.
Oh my goodness. So exciting. So how about we start with, what exactly is a polarity?
So, well, let me say this. A polarity, you've likely read about them and heard about them. There's the term we use, which is polarities in, from like an academic standpoint. A lot of people will use the word paradox to describe them. You can hear the word wicked problem or duality. So there's a number of different terms that are used out in the world. And our definition for a polarity, it's a situation where there are two states that need each other over time to be successful. They're two, and the key word here is they're interdependent states. So one makes the other true. And to our mind, they can oftentimes be seemingly contradictory. So we can think that they're opposites, but in actuality, a polarity is not an opposite. It's an interdependent state that needs each other over time for success to occur. And, some examples of those, one of the best examples that we've all experienced in organizations is this example or polarity of centralization, decentralization. So a lot of times what will happen is a new leader will come inside of an organization, and given where they are, they're either brought in and asked to do it, or they look around and see there's an opportunity to say, wow, we really need to decentralize some of these functions. We need to push, IT and HR out into the business units to give people more autonomy and more flexibility and have things go faster. And of course they do. And that works really well. And if they only focus on decentralization and kind of treat that as a problem, as an either or proposition, and they neglect centralization over time, they'll find themselves in what we call the overuses of decentralization. And oftentimes what will then happen is a new leader will come in and they'll say, oh, guess what? I have this really great idea. We need to centralize everything. And there'll be, everyone will come in, there'll be a center of excellence for quality, and the IT and HR will get centralized at the top of the house. And that when that happens, it's the pendulum, right? Whenever we hear the term, here goes the pendulum, we're swinging it, the other way. you're likely in the midst of a polarity. Not always, but that's likely. That's a sign that a polarity might be at play. Some other examples inside of organizations, structure and flexibility is one that's playing out a lot right now as corporations and organizations wrestle with, do we bring people back into the office? Do we have people continue to work remotely? Really, there's a number of polarities underneath that decision. Structure and flexibility is one of those. COVID kind of pushed us to learn about flexibility when we had more focused on structure inside of organizations. Big picture details, caring for the organization, caring for the employees of the organization. So there's a whole bunch. And as you mentioned, they play out at all levels of the system. So there's examples of ones that play out the organizational level. There's examples of polarities that play out at the leadership level. For instance, like, how do I challenge my people? How do I support my people? How do I direct my team? How do I empower my team? So those are a couple. And then there's also a whole slew of them that play out at the human level. So no matter what role we're in, work rest is another example of a polarity that showed up during COVID that we all kind of, got a bit of rewiring around, but they play out at the human level also.
So fascinating. It's so cool that we're like, bringing the whole concept of polarities into the conversation, right? Into like the story, for example, that you mentioned, or because it's everywhere. Like once you become conscious, it's everywhere. And I love how you said that there's this interdependency, like one cannot be true without the other. That's a fascinating concept. Can you dive a little bit deeper to explain that?
Yeah, sure. So from a polarity standpoint, what's true is that what we call poles, so both poles, like structure and flexibility, both poles are valuable. Both poles feel good and create good things in and of themselves, and neither is complete without the other. So a lot of times people will think that what we do is we call this one of the ways to help you learn to navigate these things first step is to what we call map them. And within a polarity, there are always benefits and there are potential overuses for each pole. And you start to see the interdependent nature when you begin to map it. Because for structure, as an example, if you look at structure flexibility, when you say, well, what are all the benefits that come from focusing on structure, right? When you put structure in place, there's efficiency, there's clarity, there's control of processes. And then if I focused on structure and thought flexibility was the silliest thing in the whole world and never provided any flexibility, over time, I would end up getting what we call overuses. So there would be rigidity, there would be a lack of innovation, there would likely be boredom. People would feel kind of micromanaged. And when we're there, the only logical solution is to swing, right? It's to head to the benefits of flexibility. And then when I get there, it's like, oh, there's adaptability. We can, there's autonomy. There's all kinds of good things that happen. And if I swing and let go of structure completely, over time, I'll end up in the overuse of flexibility, right? Which can be chaotic, which can be inefficient. And then when I'm there, the only logical solution is to head back up to structure. So the interdependency is really that the overuses of one create a need for the benefits of the other. And I would say the other thing about it, the key thing to note is what gets us into trouble, what gets leaders and organizations into trouble is a very innocent, very unconscious habit that most of us have, which is to over rely on an either or mindset and we just haven't had the practice, especially those of us that were educated in the West, we haven't had as much practice at developing a mindset, which is both and. And so really the opportunity is to supplement our either or thinking, right? Our black or white binary, either this or that, we make the decision and we move on, to supplement it with both and. Not to replace it. There's a lot of leadership literature out there as people start to become aware of both and, that they think, well, either or is ridiculous and we should get rid of either or, and the way forward is both and. Both and either or is a polarity in and of themselves. Mm-hmm. So this is not about getting rid of either or. This is about supplementing our either or thinking with both and being able to really distinguish between problems to solve. We use either or for that. Polarities to navigate. We use both and for that. So that we have better results, we have better relationships, we have better morale, and we have better communication. Because when we innocently and unconsciously mistake a polarity for a problem to solve, what the research shows is that individuals, teams, organizations suffer. And when they, what we call suffering paradoxes, is based on the work of my business partner, his research. When we suffer paradox, 4 things are negatively impacted within the organizational system. Results are negatively impacted, morale is negatively impacted, relationships are negatively impacted, and communication is regularly impacted. And when we have a way, or we give people a way to make sense of these things, which most of us can't do without some type of sense-making tool, because our brains are wired for either or. Our brains are, they just are. So without kind of taking something that we call subject, like taking something we're subject to and like pulling it out and making it object so we can start to see it and we can start to have it rather than it having us. We innocently and oftentimes unconsciously just default to either or, and we end up suffering.
Oh my goodness. So what's flowing through my mind is how important it is to have flexibility of behavior, right? To be adaptable during times of change, which is essentially all the time. Yes. And, this idea that, sometimes it is warranted and appropriate to be on one pole, right? One end of the stick. And sometimes it's appropriate on the other. And sometimes it's a more integrated approach. And so I love that you said it's a supplement, right? This kind of both and is a supplement to the either or, and just to have more options, more choices when we're conscious, not operating out of the automatic habitual.
That's right. Yeah.
So I'm curious, how does one become even more conscious of what those polarities are that might be inhibiting them in some way from achieving what they want to achieve? And what can they do about it once they're conscious?
Yeah, that's likely the hardest competency or kind of skill to build, which is seeing polarities. We work with, both leaders and inside of organizational systems. We also work with practitioners or, coaches and consultants that support leaders inside of organizational systems. And we've spent 9-12 months with folks, really helping them build the muscle for seeing a polarity. And it's just hard to do based on when you're in it, right? When the polarity has you and you don't have the polarity. And this, oftentimes what happens is the stronger the preference for a pole, there's more history around the pole, there's more of our own identity and personal narrative that's wrapped around the pole, the harder it is to step back and see in the moment, oh gosh, I'm in the midst of one of these polarities. So there's a couple of different ways that we've tried to help make that a bit more available to folks. One is we've developed these things called the key polarity indicators. And so we've done some research to discover at each level of the system, the human level, which is more relational level, the leadership level, and the organizational level, what are kind of the common polarities that show up over and over and over again in the research. And we've developed a sense-making tool called the Key Polarity Indicator. It's short, we call it the KPI for short, that you can do just with yourself to just start to help increase your own awareness. And you can also use it as a 360 sense-making tool that one just kind of gets you into, here are 6 of the key polarities you need to pay attention to as a leader and within the organization. So that's kind of one way that we've helped folks. We have workshops that we support folks in to build that muscle. And then in our book, we wrote a kind of introductory to navigating polarities. There's one whole chapter dedicated to seeing, and we've got kind of 6 different strategies, if you will, to be able to see. And I'll say this, one that I always recommend people to, there's really 2 that I always recommend people to start with. The first is notice your language. And if the word versus is anywhere in your language, pause and ask yourself, could there be a polarity at play? And then in our book, we have a whole list of polarities that you could use as like a cheat sheet to go back to and say, oh, well, maybe it's stability change. Oh, maybe it's individual team. Oh, maybe it's structure flexibility. Because what oftentimes happens is we unknowingly, and it's crazy how quickly this happens, we'll take a word on a slide, and is typically the word that's on the slide, and we will replace it. Our mind will replace it with verses like that. This is a quick story. I was doing a thing for a group of leaders a couple of months ago, and they were all getting ready to learn how to map a polarity using this sense making tool that we use. And there was a list of them. There were like 10 polarities on the sheet, on the slide, all of which said structure and flexibility, big picture and details, and. The only word that was common on the entire slide was and. And one of the leaders said, "Hey, Kelly, can we just yell out which polarity each group's going to work so that we cover more territory rather than have a bunch of people duplicate the same polarity?" I said, "Yes, great idea." So group one goes, and they say, "We're going to work task versus relationship." And I said to them, "Great, you're going to work task and relationship." And the person started laughing. They were like, "Yeah, task and relationship." Second person goes, "We're going to work big picture versus detail." I'm not kidding you. Every single group said versus. So it's just this, for me, it's it's having compassion for ourselves that, intellectually and cognitively, polarities, it makes so much sense. You quickly get it, but it's so much harder than it sounds because it happens. It's like going from here up. It's like, oh, conceptually, I get it. Here down, right? Really showing up in the world, our language, our behavior, even our body. It's a completely different thing. So many times versus is the first clue to look for. And then the second clue is if you're ever in a conversation and you find yourself kind of demonizing or othering the person or persons that are sitting across from the table from you, a polarity could also be at play. So for instance, if you and I are colleagues and we're working on a project together, and I have a preference for structure, and I really, really value structure, and I kind of see myself as like the person who brings structure to the team and helps, helps create clarity from that and helps create efficiency from that. And then in you come and you really, really, really have a preference for flexibility, and you like things to be adaptable, and you like things to be, fluid. Like what tends to happen is I tend to see me and people like me, people that prefer structure, through all the benefits of structure. And I don't really see that there's many overuses to structure at all. And guess how I tend to see you and people like you? I tend to see you through your overuses first. And I don't really see at first glance that there's any benefits to flexibility. So very quickly, I can begin demonizing you. I can begin othering you because the thing that I see you as is the thing I don't ever want to be seen as. So I'm going to push away from that. And the more I push, the more you push. And so the more we start, that's how polarization happens, right? We butt heads and then we pull further and further to the end of our spectrum. And so anytime I find myself in resistance, and I start in my head saying, that person, they're such blah, 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 whatever that might be. Not always, because not everything's a polarity, but that's a clue to at least pause and ask yourself the question, could a polarity be at play?
Wow. That's so cool because there's an ownership component to that, right? It's like there's something or someone in our life that's not quite syncing with our perception, our values, how we see the world or what we expect to see in the world. It's an invitation to take a closer look at that, to be nice and curious with some compassion, right? Thinking, maybe there's a gift, a little jewel in there for me that once I'm conscious of and I kind of soften a little bit, maybe I can also get the gifts that, for example, the structure has to balance out, harmonize my flexibility. Which kind of brings to mind this concept of the heart, right? Because you even said here up, right? So it's like, what role does compassion, curiosity, appreciation of the other, right? All of that, what role does that play, if at all, in softening some of the more extreme edges of the polarities?
Yeah, beautiful question. In our approach to polarities, it plays a huge role in that there's a brilliant writer and practitioner of this work. He uses the word paradox to describe it. His name is Parker Palmer, and he writes prolifically and beautifully about the nature of paradox. And part of what he says is that polarities or paradox are unresolvable by the mind. They're only resolvable in the heart. And, what the way we make sense of that is what the mind really wants to do. It wants to pull things apart. It wants to separate things. And in the sense-making tool that we developed, which is called the Polarity Navigator, to really help people come together and start to see a fuller picture of the two poles, the interdependent pair, and start to see their relationship to that interdependent pair more fully. We have a place on that navigator to pull the two poles apart and do exactly what the mind wants to do, which is to what we call map it, to map the benefits and the overuses. And that's a really important step because it takes something that oftentimes we're subject to and make it object. And then there's also a place on our sense-making tool that we call the transformational third way and the vulnerability through way. And that's really the place of the heart. And so what happens in that third way is it's a place to start considering reintegration. So when you pull them apart, you're differentiating. And the third way to use your word, it's around harmonizing. It's like, how do I integrate and get the best of both structure and flexibility without eliminating neither of them? What does that start to look like? And curiosity and really awareness, presence is critical. You can't do that without curiosity because it's truly a place of discovery. For many people, starting to be able to show up and lead from the place of a third way when they've been really anchored to one pole or the other over time, you're kind of deconstructing and reconstructing some part of your personal leadership identity or even the organization's identity. So it can take time. And what we found is in order to do that, there's this place on the navigator also called the vulnerability through way, which is there is oftentimes a risk, a hidden assumption, some type of discomfort / we can use one word to describe that. And this is based on the research of Brene Brown, who does a lot of research around vulnerability, if you're not familiar with her work, and naming what it is that we are putting at risk from moving off of kind of the preference of our preferred pole into this unknown territory of what we call the third way needs to be named. Because if it's not, it needs to be named, it needs to be managed, there needs to be space made for it. And what we find is that when we do, the contraction that often happens when you're in the tension of these two things that seem contradictory, but they're not to the mind, the contraction softens and it allows you to move into this place of the third way. When the fear has us, the contraction deepens, right? We get tighter. And then again, we go back to, the place where we feel most comfortable, and more polarization happens. So there's a huge role of the heart. And we think that that's why many people, ourselves included on certain polarities, aren't yet navigating polarities from both and, because it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's both a cognitive as well as an emotional practice that we have to just continue to go back to over and over and over again. So
cool. My sense is that it's a protective mechanism to not really embrace some other ways of being, especially when we've held on to a certain perception, belief, survival strategy for a long time. And so there are certain parts of us that really need to feel that it's safe to do that.
That's right.
Before we can actually embrace it and access some good learnings and resources. And what's interesting is I'm referring back in my mind to a conversation I had with a gentleman called Dr. Roland McCready. He's head of a research for an organization called the Institute of Heart Math.
Yeah.
And, in our conversation, he said the only way to dissolve these unconscious, what HeartMath calls baselines, yes, we can call them poles, whatever, these unconscious patterns, ways of being, is through the heart.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot do it just through thinking and analyzing and understanding alone.
Yeah.
So that really is validated through the work that you do. And so,
yeah, and head and heart is another lead with the head, lead with the heart. It's a polarity. So, in this, you've got to be able to give the head what it needs to make sense of it, and you've got to make the space for the heart to, do exactly as your colleague from HeartMath was talking about, also. So another both and there.
And that's so cool, because the state of what we call coherence, which is the state of optimal performance and health, is right coherent brain, coherent heart, right? They're working together, the communication, synchronization happening at the physiological level.
Yeah.
And so what do you think is really important for perhaps some leaders that are listening to us today that are really struggling with conflict? Like there is that tug of war happening. Mm-hmm. And whether it's internal, where part of them says something and a part of them says something else, right? Like there's kind of a inner conflict of some sort, or maybe an external conflict, like you said, where they believe something, certain approach, and somebody else believes something different. What suggestions might you have for them to ease some of the conflict?
Yeah. So many times when a polarity is at play, conflict is a part. When a polarity is at play and people are treating it as a problem to solve rather than a polarity, they're just unaware of that. A lot of time what happens is conflict enters into the system. And there are times when polarities are not at play and conflict is in the system. So I just want to be like, polarities are everywhere and not everything is a polarity. It's really important that people hear that, because once we start looking for them and we realize, oh, they are truly kind of they're not new, right? They've been around since the beginning of time. What's new is that we now have ways to make sense of them. And so that's really my advice, which is to find a sense-making tool. And because until you do, you will be subject to it. It will have, if there's conflict there, it likely already has you or has some part of the conversation. And what we have found when using sense-making tools with our clients, what it does is it provides literal and metaphorical space for everyone to have a voice and to have a place. And as soon as that happens, it expands what I can see. So, when I'm sitting down at the table with you and the polarity of structure flexibility has me, and all I can see is that, gosh, all Vered wants to do is create more chaos, right? That's all I can see. The minute we pull out a sense-making tool and start to what we call map it, it gives me a fuller picture. And I'm like, oh, what Vered's also bringing to the conversation is this need for fluidity, this need for adaptability. And yeah, I value that, right? I see that we also need that. And she maybe can now see that there's a need for clarity and efficiency. And so we start to just step back and say, oh, yeah, like I can see a fuller picture. So part of it is expanding what we can see. I mean, that's really what we have to be able to do, and have enough humility to realize I can't see everything, right? I can't see it all. So oftentimes the conflict eases enough after you've done a mapping exercise like that to be able to move into healthy conversations where you still might not agree, but you can see a fuller picture to then be able to make some decisions and move forward. It doesn't mean it's all, peaches and cream. And the more you can see the fuller picture and your relationship to it, the more you're at choice rather than kind of habitually doing what you've always done. So that'd be my advice. A sense-making tool is critical in this type of work. That doesn't mean it's critical for conflict, because I'm not a conflict specialist. But what I do know is that when we're in the midst of a polarity and we're treating it as an either or proposition rather than a both and proposition, oftentimes conflict is a part of that conversation.
Yeah, and what we know from research on high-performing teams, at least out of Google and other organizations, is that when everyone feels heard and validated, right, when there's equal airtime, so to speak, and there's respect. We might not agree with one another. I might not agree with your perception, right? This other end, if you will, of the stick, of the polarity. And I respect that this is your perception. And I'm curious to learn more about it and how it might benefit the system overall. And I think that mindset then allows us to perceive other things that, as you said earlier, we might have completely not even been conscious of, right? We can kind of begin to access those possibilities. So once
one of the things, if I can just say,
yes,
based on what you just said, I so appreciate that and agree with what you're saying. And one of the things, one of my teachers often said, Barry Johnson, is that seeing is loving. And that when we are in a conversation and we can't see it, right, it's difficult. And as we start to map and we can see each other and ourselves and the system more fully, right, it's really hard to not love each other more fully because we can see each other more fully. And so, when that starts to happen, we can move forward rather being stuck in this resistance, stuck in this cycle where all the conflict, exists. And so with seeing, there's understanding. And as he always says, seeing is loving, which I couldn't agree with more.
Oh my goodness, that just warms my heart because I believe it's true. And I think that, we can kind of almost see ourselves in other people. All of a sudden we see, that person that I thought was totally different, there's something there, right? There's some part of me that's mirrored in that. And once we can kind of see that, we realize that all these different people or parts or whatever, they're all part of the same whole, right? We're all integrated, if you will, in some level. And then it kind of allows us to be even more compassionate and forgiving and just allow more kind of a softer approach. Yeah. So how can people learn even more about this work, the sense-making tool, your books, your trainings? How can we access even more of that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We'd love to explore, any way that polarities can be a lens in the organization's leadership development. And we find that with many of our clients, bringing it in is just that. It's a lens to help them navigate and deal with the complexity that they're in can be super useful. So there's a couple different ways. You can go to andiron, andiron.com. And there's an entire section on that website that's all about navigating polarities. You can get access to our book. You can get access to our workshops. We have some open enrollment workshops around navigating polarities. We also have something that's called On Demand that oftentimes we bring into organizations, and it's kind of bite-sized learning about how to navigate polarities at people's pace. And it's set up for small groups, small teams, minimum of 2, and then maximum of 6 to 8 to go through together. And, you pause and kind of go through it and have conversations. So you can go through it with us live virtually. You can also go through it with us at your own pace where we're with you, but we're not there kind of live virtually, if you will. And then of course there's the book, and we've got, you can find that on the website. It's a short kind of introductory, it's like 150 page book that introduces people to our approach to navigating polarities. And soon to be, when we wrote the first book, it was intended to be a series. And so we're in the midst right now of writing polarities and hybrid work. And we also just kicked off yesterday, actually, one around polarities and DEI, because what we find is that polarities can be a really useful lens to look at a very specific topic that's challenging to our organizational clients. Hybrid work has been a really challenging thing for many of us, as has DEI. And so there are a number of different ones. At some point, we're going to do navigating polarities and parenting, because I hear that that's also a tough one. So be on the lookout for additional books coming, but that's the one that you could start with if you're interested. And then lastly, you can learn about the key polarity indicator on that website as well, if folks are curious to find out, what are kind of some of the common polarities that show up again and again, and what's my relationship to them. You can use that. You can reach out to us to explore how to use that in your organization to work with polarities also.
Oh, excellent. Congratulations on your work and continuing to expand the work, because I think that when we create more harmony, whether it's within ourselves, in our families, in our teams, in our organizations, the world is just an even better place.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you. Thank you again, Kelly, for your
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Pure joy.